All right, I think we have a critical mass here. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 11th episode of Data Talks, which is a series of free 45-minute webinars about using local data to inform housing policy. My name is Tony Budulovic. I am the Data and Policy Analyst at the Housing Solutions Lab, and I'm super excited to talk to all of you today about advancing housing resilience with data. I'm also joined by two amazing panelists who we'll speak to a bit later, Victoria Wang, postdoctoral fellow at the NYU Furman Center, and Berenice Algaramti, Buildings Equity Administrator at the City and County of Denver, Colorado. Since this is a special Climate Week episode, I will start things off with a brief introduction to what we do at the Housing Solutions Lab, and then a little bit of background on this series as well. I'll then give a presentation on various data tools, both federal and local, that can guide cities in embedding climate and resiliency work into their housing strategy. Then we'll move on to a conversation with Vicky and Berenice about their experiences with addressing climate and housing goals together. And finally, we'll close with about 10 to 15 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A function at any time during the session, and we will get to as many of them as we can. All right, great. So if you're not familiar with the Housing Solutions Lab, we are based at the NYU Furman Center, and our mission is to help small and mid-sized cities plan, launch, and evaluate housing policies with the goal of advancing equity, health, and well-being. Our Data Talks episodes typically feature a presentation on how cities can integrate data into their housing goals, as well as a fireside chat with someone like Vicky or Berenice, who have experience on the ground. We also include recommended reading for those of you that want to go even deeper into the topics that we cover. So I hope you will all take the opportunity to view past episodes on our website and register for upcoming ones as well. I'll be dropping a link to the series landing page in the chat. All right. And with that, I want to say thank you again for joining us today, and we will move into the presentation. Great. So today, we know that climate risks from extreme heat to flooding are becoming more frequent and more hazardous to communities and their housing. And as cities are thinking about how to respond, they're also facing multiple challenges. For example, understanding which households are most at risk, responding to immediate threats, and ensuring that their strategies are contributing to long-term housing sustainability. We know that data can play a key role in tackling these challenges, so today I'll be walking through a number of different data sources and strategies that cities can adopt to hopefully advance housing resilience locally. Many of these data sets and policy approaches are summarized in a recent brief from the lab called Using Climate Data for Resilient Housing Solutions. And I'll be posting a link in the chat shortly. And I hope that you'll be able to take a look and explore the additional examples and guidance within. Okay, so with that, we're going to turn to the data itself. So when it comes to the data, there are a couple of primary uses that climate and environmental data can provide for a housing strategy. This data can assess the current and future risk of different hazards, from climate events like hurricanes to environmental hazards like particulate matter or wastewater discharge. This data can also identify which residents are the most vulnerable. So for example, there might be certain neighborhoods in your city that are more prone to flooding or are maybe more exposed to dangerous pollutants. Data can even help quantify the economic impact of certain climate hazards, and we'll touch on how to make this type of analysis more equitable as well later in the session. And finally, this data can ultimately guide the overall planning of housing and infrastructure that encourages future resiliency and aligns with broader affordability and equity goals. I'll walk through each of these in turn with different examples of available tools that your city can hopefully put into practice. So starting off with risk assessment, cities can begin by understanding which hazards are most relevant for their region. So for example, wildfires might be a really pressing climate issue for some of you, but for other cities, that hazard is rarely a concern. And once you surface these hazards, it's really helpful to map them or visualize them in a way that not only represents the current present day risks, but also projected changes in the future. This type of analysis can highlight subsets of your housing stock that might be especially vulnerable to climate risks and hopefully help you create a plan for action. So one tool that is really critical for risk assessment is FEMA's National Risk Index. FEMA arrives at its risk index for a given location by using metrics for both expected annual losses and social vulnerability. FEMA also provides a map of this data, which you can see here on the screen, which gives users an interactive way to view hazard risk levels at both the county and the census tract level. And that second one is really important if you want to compare risks across neighborhoods within your city. This tool also allows you to compare risk levels within your state and also the country as a whole to help you contextualize what might be going on. And right now, we're actually looking at an example of the risk index for Jefferson County in Kentucky, which includes the city of Louisville. The risk index here is relatively high for this county due to the high incidence of ice storms, riverine flooding, and strong winds. We won't be doing any live demos today, unfortunately, but these slides will soon be up on our website where you'll be able to click through the links on each slide and hopefully explore the tools in more detail. Another important federal tool for risk assessment is the Climate Mapping for Resilience and Adaptation platform, or CMRA. This resource goes beyond existing risk to provide more long-term and tract level climate projections on extreme heat, flooding, and other common hazards. So for example, cities can gain insight into the current and projected number of days per year that have heavy precipitation, and also those that have a maximum temperature over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So here we're looking at Charleston County in South Carolina. We can see that higher emissions are associated with a greater number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So lower emissions, about 78 days, with higher emissions around 88 days. And as you can see on this graph in the bottom right corner, the data also compares historical trends with different projections for the early century, mid-century, and late century, which can give you a better idea about how these hazards can compound over time. I also wanted to give an example of how these data tools are being used in practice, especially when it comes to risk assessment. Here, we're going to look at Maryland, where the state's Department of Emergency Management wanted to identify communities that had limited transportation access and high coastal flood risk, since it would be the most difficult for those residents who live there to evacuate from their homes. The department ended up using FEMA's National Risk Index, which we just covered, to identify 4 island communities, including Cobb Island here, that were especially vulnerable to flooding, and they had few options to leave the island in case there was an emergency. After identifying those communities, Maryland is now planning to use that data to guide outreach to residents and also improve their disaster response planning with members of the community. I think that's a great segue into our next section, because beyond hazards themselves, it's also really critical to understand who is most vulnerable. And we know that events like hurricanes or blizzards might affect entire communities, but some residents are often disproportionately impacted. For example, it could be that seniors who live in your community have limited access to cooling or evacuation resources, or that low-income households live in closer proximity to wastewater sites. And in many cases, tenants are especially vulnerable to various hazards because they don't have the same ability to weatherize their homes, and they don't have the same standing when it comes to accessing federal disaster assistance. But by using data to understand these inequities, cities can more accurately target support, prioritize interventions, and even design housing strategies that reduce risk for those who need it most. And so, for this type of equity-based analysis, the EPA's EJ screening tool is a really great resource. This tool is available at the census tract level, and it connects socioeconomic indicators with a range of environmental burden indicators, from hazardous waste proximity to particulate matter to wastewater discharge. It also provides environmental justice indexes, which take all of those variables and reveal the neighborhoods that are especially affected by environmental hazards. So going back to those burden indicators, we can see in this example on my screen that several tracts in Portland are among the highest in the country for lead paint exposure, as noted by that red color. If your city has a similar finding by using the EJ Screen tool, you might consider responding with a targeted lead abatement program, for example, or a different type of intervention that will protect the health and safety of affected neighborhoods. Cities can take this analysis even further with the US Climate Vulnerability Index map. This resource pulls together over 180 data sets to compare the relationship between a community's socioeconomic conditions with its climate impacts. The map that you see here combines these metrics and assigns a vulnerability score for every single census tract. This resource can also generate detailed reports on the primary drivers of an area's climate vulnerability. So on the bottom right, you can see this tract in Southwest Detroit, higher vulnerability, 79th national vulnerability percentile. And then you can also go into more detail by viewing the report. I wanted to share another example of how these tools are being used in practice to highlight environmental harms in communities and also inspire action to protect residents. A few years ago, advocates and regulators used the EJ Screen tool to identify that St. John the Baptist Parish in Louisiana faced some of the highest cancer risks from air pollution in the country. This region is often referred to as Cancer Alley because nearly 200 chemical plants line the Mississippi River corridor. Residents report that generations of families, most of whom are Black, have experienced health complications linked to pollution in the area. And many community members see this disproportionate exposure as part of a broader legacy of discriminatory policies like redlining or segregation. Today, the parish continues to rely on the EJ Screen tool to advocate for changes that can make neighborhoods healthy and their housing safer, while advancing environmental justice for the families that have been affected. Our next category is about quantifying potential economic impacts, which I think is pretty closely connected to assessing risk. And for this use case, data is also pretty critical for estimating losses from property damage or displacement, and it can also help inform cities, inform how they allocate resources or implement mitigation strategies as well. FEMA's National Risk Index, which I covered a few slides earlier, is also useful for this type of analysis. In addition to hazard risk, the tool provides detailed estimates on the drivers of economic loss. So here we're looking at a tract in Nashville where most of the loss is expected to come from riverine flooding. You can see on the right that FEMA actually estimates an expected annual loss of over $6 million here, which is further broken down into building and population level measures. Understanding the sources and potential scale of these economic impacts can really help cities make informed choices about where to direct resilience investments. However, I also want to note that many sources, including FEMA, rely on a metric called EAL, or expected annual loss. Researchers are beginning to warn that this metric might overstate risk in wealthier areas with higher valued homes and understate it in lower income areas. And some researchers, like those at the Urban Institute, are suggesting that cities also look at total replacement value, which is a metric that adjusts for lower building values by calculating the replacement cost as a percentage of each structure's value. It's a little bit more complicated, but analyzing data this way can help keep equity at the center when we're thinking about economic impacts. Okay, and the last use case I want to touch on is planning for resilient housing and infrastructure. There are a number of ways that data can support an innovative housing strategy that centers climate impacts and protects communities. For example, data can help us direct new development away from high-risk areas, ensuring that future housing isn't built in places that are really vulnerable to flooding, heat, or other climate hazards. It can also help us retrofit and benchmark existing housing so older buildings meet more modern resilience and efficiency standards. Data can also be vital for protecting affordability and identifying neighborhoods that may need additional subsidy or support during resiliency upgrades so that improvements don't displace the very communities that they aim to protect. And lastly, data can essentially create a new language between housing and climate agencies by improving coordination and aligning goals on these important and overlapping issues. One example of using climate data for a comprehensive housing strategy can be seen in California, which has created fire hazard severity zones, or FHSZs, to respond to and plan for wildfires across the state. The state uses data from a variety of sources, including historical fires, vegetation types, climate conditions, and topography, to identify and then map these zones. And once the hazard of a given area has been determined, properties in that zone must comply with certain regulations to ensure resident safety. So, for example, properties may be required to adhere to a stronger version of the building code, often referred to as Chapter 7A, which mandates fire-resistant roofs and walls. And other requirements may include defensible space zones, which are areas around the properties that are free of flammable materials, or mandatory hazard disclosures. And because these regulations are using data to target compliance, they're able to more effectively reduce risks and as well as the impacts of wildfires, especially when it comes to housing. And the final example I want to show is Honolulu's Better Buildings benchmarking dashboard. In Oahu, the building sector accounts for roughly 1/3 of the island's total greenhouse gas emissions. And under the city's climate action plan, the city identified benchmarking as a major pathway to not only reducing these emissions, but also achieve net negative emissions by 2045. A 2022 city ordinance helped create this benchmarking dashboard that you see here, which the city uses to track energy use and emissions across buildings, but also encourage owners to improve the efficiency of their building. Tools like this show how local governments can not only use data to assess climate risk, but also identify buildings in needs of upgrades, monitor progress over time, and set performance targets that can drive long-term improvements. Okay, we'll hear more about benchmarking really soon during our panel, but that concludes my presentation. I'm already seeing some great questions in the Q&A, so please keep sending those our way. We'd also love to hear from you about how your cities are using data to align climate and housing goals, or if you have any questions about the work that we do at the Housing Solutions Lab. I've included my email address here, and you can also reach us through Ask the Lab, which is a page on our website, which is localhousingsolutions.org. Great. Okay, so for this next part of the webinar, we will hear from our guests about how data can support climate and housing goals and how cities can use it to guide decisions, track progress, and drive meaningful action. Our panelists today, I think, are especially well positioned to help us think through these topics. Victoria Wang is a postdoctoral fellow at the NYU Furman Center. Her research explores adaptive migration and the effects of disasters on housing decisions. And Berenice Algaramti is the Buildings Equity Administrator for the City and County of Denver, Colorado. Her work involves long-term climate solutions with a focus on making decarbonization and energy efficiency more equitable for Denver residents. First off, thank you both for being here. We really, really appreciate it. Vicki, I was hoping you could start off this conversation by telling us a little bit more about your research and what cities can learn from it as they're working to assess housing risk more holistically.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Tony. So broadly, I'm interested in how individuals react to large changes in their life and the way that the government can help them navigate this. And I studied this in my dissertation in the context of wildfires in California. And in particular, I'm interested in how people move after experiencing a wildfire and whether they move to a safe place. And so this is what I'm calling adaptive migration. And I focus on this because there are multiple adaptation channels after experiencing a disaster or to minimize the cost of a disaster. But I think adaptive migration can be useful as a long-term strategy because a lot of the large costs associated with disasters comes from the fact that there's a lot of people living in these disaster-prone areas. But there's an issue in that safe places tend to be more expensive. So how
Oh, sorry. I think you're frozen, Vicki. While we wait for you to return, I think we might be able to turn to Berenice for now. So Berenice, you're deeply engaged in the long-term work of responding to climate risks. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about how Denver is working to make housing more energy efficient and resilient.
Sure, Tony, and thank you again for the invite to be in this space. As you said, my work focuses on ensuring that our city building decarbonization efforts don't leave anyone behind, especially renters, seniors, immigrant families. And through our programming, we help property owners and residents access to incentives and resources to make housing both energy efficiency and affordable. Back to your question. In Denver, we see housing resiliency and energy efficiency as inseparable, right? You cannot separate one from another. And through our Energize Denver ordinance, that is our building performance standards, we require commercial and multifamily buildings to reduce their energy use intensity over time. And within that, we build an equity priority buildings program to ensure properties or building owners serving climate vulnerable communities are not left behind. Our team provides compliant assistance to meet these targets. We help property owners with benchmarking, understanding. We provide free energy audits. We provide navigation support on utility rebates and incentives because there are so many, but sometimes we don't know where to start, right? And apart from that, we also provide financial coaching. If there is one bid for one contractor or another, our financial coaches tell them a good recommendation. And in some cases, we provide also referrals to partners that provide funding for both energy costs and housing items. As I can say, our goal is not just to meet climate targets, but make homes healthier, more comfortable, and affordable for the people that live there.
That's awesome. Thank you both for sharing your insights there. I want to talk specifically about data next, since this is a data talk, and it plays a critical role in both assessing the risk to housing and planning for long-term resilience, like you said, Berenice. So, oftentimes cities are thinking about risk in the context of geographic factors like flood zones or tree cover. And some cities are also considering socioeconomic factors in their analyses. And Vicky, your research adds another key piece, which is housing affordability. Can you explain to us about how data on rent and cost burden, for example, can inform resiliency planning and risk assessment?
Hi, am I back?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think data is really important to understand this because with disasters, of course, they don't care if you're rich or poor. They're going to hit everyone. But the key difference is that people can adjust. And so we see that people who can afford to live elsewhere can leave. And this often leads to prices in these disaster risky places to drop and become more affordable. But on the other hand, there are places that have high disaster risk that also have great features that make them attractive places to live. So you can imagine, being next to the forest, next to the ocean. And so understanding who is bearing this risk and their ability to cope with this risk is very important for city planning and for disaster relief. And similarly to that, understanding why people are living in these risky places is important for designing these equitable policies. And so data on rent and cost burden are really helpful to understand what attracts people to these areas and their ability to adapt if something were to happen. And because the government, right, has limited resources, they need to really consider what their priorities are. And there's a lot of different trade-offs in implementing policies. And there's a lot of ways to go about addressing disaster risk. So you can think about maybe we want to help everyone a little bit, but is that really fair if people are living there because they wanted the great view and they can afford to live elsewhere? Is it fair, people are living here because there's no other places? Should we preemptively help them move? So these are very complicated questions, and there's no clear answers, but we need to understand, this landscape. And in order to understand the landscape, we need this data.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super important. Thank you for highlighting that tension. I want to turn to Berenice now because Denver also uses a variety of data sources, especially at the building level. And I'm curious how your team brings all of those data sources together and what should cities be thinking about if they want to use data to drive housing decarbonization?
Sure, Tony. In Denver, we integrate benchmarking data, utility consumption. Our friends from our housing department, they provide some indicators, and every year they tell us, these portfolio of buildings are affordable housing. We also have some, proxies for natural occurring affordable housing and condos, and that can be very time intensive in digging it because there is not like a database on them. If someone knows that, please let me know. And we also build our equity priority buildings equity index. And is very similar to what you show us in your presentation, and is an interactive index that overlays the building data that we had through our assessor office that they provide us with social and demographic indicators such as income, renter burden, language isolation, and environmental justice metrics. And this index lets us identify which buildings face both high emissions and high vulnerability. And for other cities, my recommendation and the lesson is that don't treat energy data in isolation. Build a framework that combines performance data with equity metrics so you can direct resources to the places that really need the greatest help. So you can have a great impact in climate and also in community.
It's a really great recommendation. Thank you, Berenice. Back to Vicky. So when it comes to modeling housing risk, there's often a tension between looking backward, like using data from past disasters, but also you want to plan ahead for the future, and those different types of climate scenarios that might occur. I'm wondering how you look at this and how cities can balance these approaches effectively.
Yeah, so I think honestly, having as much information as possible is really key to planning effectively for the future. And of course, past natural disasters can be very informative of future risk. So with wildfires, for instance, you need fuel to burn. And so once it's burned, sure, in the immediate aftermath, disaster risk for that particular area could go down. But the fact that, when the vegetation grows back, there's risk again. On the other hand, climate change is making these disasters more common and severe. And there are new places that are risky because they're becoming drier and hotter. And climate modeling, although it's still imprecise, has really improved in precision. And people can use this as a way of understanding, which areas are risky. But there's a caveat, of course. So even in areas that are modeled to be high risk, disasters are still a relatively rare occurrence. So your likelihood of your particular place being burned, right, it's not a guaranteed thing. So it's important to leverage as much information as possible, both from the past and with this modeling, but also understand that it's not, a guarantee for the future. And so being okay with that uncertainty. And I think insurance companies understand this implicitly. And so I think California in particular can be a warning in this case. So until very recently, California only allowed insurance companies to price based on previous disasters, and they really limited the premium increases you can have year over year. And so as climate modeling has improved and insurance companies are taking advantage of this, they see that there are certain areas which are actually very high risk that they didn't know before, but they're not able to price accordingly. And so they have actually chosen to drop coverage altogether and pull out from these high risk areas. And that is, in a way, the worst case scenario because those groups of people are likely the ones who need to have this financial insurance in case something happens. And so all of this is just to say that data is very informative, but of course there's still uncertainty, which is inevitable. And when entities are not allowed to use all of the information, it can lead to really negative and worst case scenarios.
Yeah, all of that is super important and really highlights this difficulty of looking backward, but also wanting to look forward and use all data that's available. And then that forward looking perspective, I think, is especially critical to Berenice and your work that you do in Denver. So I'm curious about, based on your experience, what approaches do you find are most effective for building equity into this type of data that you're collecting, particularly within underserved communities or neighborhoods?
Thank you, Tony. And I can speak for what the equity index has shown us that equity must be built into your data architecture from the beginning. For example, in our index, we didn't just map energy burden or environmental factors, right? We also add layers like income levels, rent burden, race, ethnicity, language access, other socioeconomic factors that you usually don't really link to environmental aspects from the beginning. As well, we just didn't rely just on data that we had, data sets. We also chat with community partners because sometimes community leaders, they can give us insights from their neighborhoods that we don't have and we don't see in the data. And that way, the index doesn't show just where a building is located in environmental terms, but also who lives there and what barriers they face. So cities can embed equity into their housing resiliency work. If they want to do it, they should invest in these tools and have budget to talk to these communities that can help us, make these disparities visible and keep updating with community leaders, because there is some criteria that we don't find it in data. We need to get out in the community and have those conversations because sometimes the needs evolve.
I completely agree. Thanks so much for sharing. And I actually want to stay on this topic because we know that climate data isn't just for policymakers, residents and communities need it too, but it can be really hard to access or use, like you highlighted, Bernice. So I'm wondering what your take is on this, because how can cities, not only share energy and utility data, but also support residents in acting on it, whether that's through incentives, tools, or even partnerships?
Yeah, sure. And really, our index, I have a chance to present the index with some promotoras, and I did it in English and Spanish. And I told them, you need to use this tool when you are asking for funding, because they can go to their elected officials, so they can put in a grant based on that on our equity index. We have a poorer quality, so that's why we need to plant trees, etc., right? So they can use it as a tool for funding and also to speak out with elected officials. And we also, based on the index, we can target our reach. Like, we are not receiving enough applications from this neighborhood, so let's go and see what's going on there, right? For example, the index helps us highlight if a multifamily building is in an energy burdened neighborhood. So our team will visit the building on site, and we're going to bring with us some flyers on energy assistance, weatherization, if there is some electrification incentives, we also bring it. And the most important thing, as I mentioned before, is we work with trusted CBOs, community-based organizations, to help us deliver the message. Because many of these communities come from countries that when they don't trust the government. So we need to work with these community messengers that help us deliver the idea. And then it's a combination between data, community engagement, and make it cultural relevant, and it becomes lovely. So in 2022, we did all this work, and thanks to that, we were able to build these compliant systems to equity priority buildings by working with the community.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And from your perspective, Vicky, I'm wondering what you see as some of the best ways to make risk and disaster data more accessible to tenants, homeowners, or local organizations.
Yeah, so in order for data to make an impact, people need to be incentivized to search and be able to find and understand the data. And so for the first part, people are pretty incentivized right now to care. I think disasters are top of mind, and people are very aware of the impacts of these disasters. And so for governments and cities to offer resources to help people learn about these disasters, to make plans, to prepare, making evacuation plans, ways of alleviating the risk, those resources, having them tied to information about the riskiness would be really helpful. Another potential thing to help would be building codes. So there is some evidence with California had mandated some building code requirements, and they find that mandating it was very effective in reducing the wildfire destruction. And there's a paper on this, and it even had spillover effects on your neighbors. So it seems that having these mandated building codes can have wider effects and in helping people understand the risk and also giving them the tools to do it. And another thing that could happen is potentially involving insurance companies. So most people need to pay insurance on their home for their mortgage, and this price can be a signal to people about the risk. But of course, we need to make sure that insurance companies are pricing by this risk. And then the second part of this is having the resources out there. And so I think someone mentioned in the Q&A, Redfin, Zillow, they both allow people to check the climate risks of their properties. Like Tony mentioned, FEMA has census tract level scores of various disasters, and this is what I used for my dissertation. And your city may want to collect specific data on risk and disasters that could be difficult to do on a national scale. And so this is related to what Berenice was saying. And one particular thing that I think would be really awesome to have is a database on the modifications on your homes. And that can really make your home more resilient, even if it's not required. And having that information can help nonprofits and aid organizations really see which areas could have the biggest need. And another way the city could encourage this is either, tax breaks or subsidies. And when you're doing this, you're collecting information that could then be linked with tax assessors. And so, of course, there's like a lot of information which can be difficult for people to navigate. So if there's a way to create a tool that's allows people to just search their own address and see these outcomes, that could also be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much for sharing your insights here. I want to turn to the Q&A section now because we're getting some really great Q&A questions in the chat. The first one I want to address is that some people have noted that the EJ Screen tool is actually not publicly available anymore, and this is true. It has been removed by the EPA on their website, but there are several archived versions that you can also easily access by searching for this tool online. So you're still able to use those insights. But beyond that, I want to turn back to Vicky and Berenice on housing codes. And I know you were just talking about housing codes, Vicky. This person is asking a question about housing codes and how they're imperative to reducing risk and preventing danger and hidden costs for potential future residents, but they can often become barriers to affordability. So while you said, for example, that a lot of housing codes can limit risk and reduce risk for residents, they might actually impose additional costs as well. And I'm wondering what your take is on this from your research or from your own experience.
Yeah, I can talk first, I guess. I think this is very related to the broader trend of neighborhoods that also are safer, also tend to be more expensive. So I think in general, there is this concern that affordability and risk seem to be at odds with each other. But I don't necessarily think that needs to be the case. So there could be, like location specific ways of clearing the dry brush around your property or around your town. So Paradise, which burned down in 2018 from the Camp Fire, they're in their rebuilding effort right now, very intentionally designing like fire structure breaks around their community to prevent it from happening. So there are ways that extend beyond the individual homeowner that the city can implement that can help with that. Another thing could be, like subsidies or tax breaks, like I mentioned, to help individuals. And I guess the other nice thing is that like the paper I mentioned, and I can link it in the Q&A as well. They find that even if your home was not up to that code, if your neighbor's was, that your home was also like more likely to be protected because for these urban fires, a lot of the spread happens from home to home. So even having a neighbor or someone in that community who's able to do this, even if you're not able to, there can be this spillover effect.
Thank you so much. And I guess a similar question for you is, Berenice, is also related to building codes. And if you're seeing in Denver how building codes are intersecting with equity and your ability to make those buildings more equitable when it comes to decarbonization and efficiency.
Yeah, I think in Denver, I don't work in that department in specific, but we collaborate a lot with the planning department, and I know they have been updating the housing code, especially for residential apartments for new construction to require all electric or electric ready, solar ready. to better support the future of electrification, and for our existing buildings. There is a requirement, and depends of it makes financial sense that at the end of a useful life, like the HVAC system, they need to be electrified. But again, that's why we have this equity priority buildings compliant assistance to help navigate all those requirements, provide support to equity buildings, and in this case, affordable housing, nonprofit, commercial buildings with limited revenue. So we are there to support them navigate future updates in the code.
Absolutely. Great. We also have a few questions related to eviction and how that relates to risk. And I think both of you can hopefully jump in here. So for Vicky, we're wondering, this respondent is asking if in your research or if you've seen how eviction processes intersect with residential resiliency.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and a great question, and it's not something that I'm incorporating in my research as of now. But I think it's very interesting, and from my understanding, if it is a disaster, a declared disaster, I think there are some restrictions on what landlords can do. If your property is destroyed, for instance, and you're a renter, the landlord needs to has responsibilities to you. But beyond that, I'm not sure. But I agree. I think it's a very interesting and important thing to consider.
Yeah, definitely. Berenice, you might have a little bit more to say here, as in if your work is also looking at eviction data as a way to promote equity in these buildings, or if eviction data comes into play at all.
Sure. We don't. I froze.
We can still hear you, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. My program doesn't really manage eviction data, but we collaborate with the housing department. And for example, 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, we are requiring a residential license, a rental license, sorry. So if you have a unit that you are renting, you need to have a license, and that help us identify some working with this department that work with eviction and the rental license, so they can send us leads like, hey, this apartment, their tenants might face some evictions. So is there a way that you can support them so we can give them resources for rental assistance, utility assistance? And we send referrals to the CBOs helping on that. But it's not something that I do through my program, but it's something I hear, and that's why we send referrals. Because one of the things that we want to avoid through our ordinance is unintended consequences on displacement and gentrification.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that many cities now are grappling with the effects of what is called a renoviction, where the building is being upgraded for energy efficiency, but that might end up with tenants or residents being displaced. So I think it's really great.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Tony, that's very important to look at the building envelope first,
Mhm.
and then do electrification. But it's my recommendation, especially with older buildings, that if they have a leaky envelope, do weatherization, energy efficiency upgrades, and then look at electrification. Because we have a case here in Denver that one building owner lost 2 tenants because they installed heat pumps, but they have a leaky envelope, so that the utility bills increased instead of seeing benefits.
I see.
It has been one of the lessons learned, and we're pushing for building envelope, weatherization, energy efficiency, and then if it's feasible, do electrification.
Great. Thank you for sharing that recommendation. It's super, super important. And okay, I think we are at time. That's all the time we have for today. But we will be sure to post a recording of this webinar and the slides on our website very soon. And you'll be able to find that in the chat. I'll post a link. And yeah, I want to say thank you again to our panelists and to all of you for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you at another Data Talk really, really soon. So thank you again, Vicky. Thank you again, Berenice.
Thank you, Tony. Have a good day.
Yeah, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.